Hello, or bienvenidos everybody, and welcome back to the National Histories podcast. If this is your first time tuning in, allow me to introduce what we are about. So, we aim to tell a brief history of every country in the world as objectively, briefly, and lightheartedly as we possibly can. As simple as that, basically. So, my name is Alex, and I'll be your host for today's episode, in which we'll be talking about Mexico. I say we, because joining me as usual is my dear old pal Luke Osborne. How are you, mate?
Hola.
Oh, hola,
Estoy
señor.
bien.
Está bien.
¿Cómo estás, señor de la Valla?
Señor de la Valla.
Yeah, no, I'm fine.
dear.
This is an English podcast.
Yes,
about
yes, it is.
Mexico. Yeah, I'm fine. Thanks.
This is an English podcast about Mexico. Yes, thank you for that.
Yeah, just to let everyone know that they haven't just
If
tuned
they
in to
decide
listen to some broken Spanish.
they skip the first 30 seconds, yeah,
Yeah.
then and that's necessary to say.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm assuming that means you're good. Yes.
Yeah, all is well. It's really
All
hot
is
and
well.
stuffy here, and I've had to
It
close
is,
all the windows
same.
so I don't get all the background noise from the building work.
It's a
And
pain, isn't it?
it's 36 degrees in London.
Yep.
Which
Which,
as
you know,
everyone knows
is
is just
Far,
horrible.
far too hot.
Yeah.
For us milky.
Well, no, it's
Englishmen.
not. Well, yeah. I mean, I would say I am suffering, but
But you know, we're
I'll
always
suffer through.
suffering, aren't we?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
Okay, well, with that all said,
hmm
with that unnecessarily convoluted introduction,
Yeah.
would you like to know my interesting fact for this episode?
Well, you didn't ask me how much I know about Mexico.
Bugger, I didn't. How much do you know about Mexico? A fair bit,
A
I would
lot.
imagine. A lot? Oh, what's a lot? Quantify a lot for me.
All of it,
Oh, God. Okay.
up and down,
Well,
left and right. No, I know. Yeah, I know. I think I know a fair bit about Mexico's history.
aye.
Obviously, like I've done a couple of countries in Central America so far, and obviously
Yeah, sure.
their early history is very wound up in Mexico,
Yep.
especially in the early colonial period. Then there's just it's just a big country, isn't it? And
It
quite
is,
central
it
to
is.
lots of things.
Yeah, and as we'll kind of explore, the Mesoamerican civilizations were not. I mean, they were sort of aggregated around the Mexican Valley or the Central Mexican Valley, but often spilled into those Central American countries you're referring to.
Yes.
So lots and lots of overlap.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so I'm hoping for lots of discussion then as we progress.
Perhaps. Although,
Perhaps.
as I said, it's hot and stuffy, so
Indeed.
you
It's
might just
actually
have a passed out Luke Osborne at the end of this.
Let's hope not. Today's actually one of the few days where I'm enjoying the fact that my little office room that I have doesn't have any windows. Because it's kind of like shaded. The rest of the house obviously has the sun coming into it, and this is the only room that's kind of sheltered from that. So it's actually a little bit cooler, which is quite good.
And then I guess you've got the exposed brick walls as well, don't you?
Yeah, exactly. Anyhow,
Always colder.
so interesting fact, if you'd like to know it.
Yeah, I would like to know it.
Now, some parts of Mexico City, interestingly, are actually sinking by about 8 to 15 inches per year. And this is because the capital was built on the ruins of the Aztec capital Tenochtitlan, which was itself built on a lake. As to why the Aztecs decided to build their capital there, I'll come back to that later. But when you think about how Venice, by comparison, is sinking by about an inch a year, 8 to 15 is pretty drastic. So some buildings have become lopsided and there are fissures in the surface, and it's become a real problem for Mexico from a sort of civil engineering perspective. And it's quite possible that large swathes of people will eventually have to move. It's also related to lots of water issues too.
I watched a BBC documentary on, like one of those like half an hour like documentaries on the news channel.
Yeah.
That they do on like the weekends. They did one on this exact issue.
Oh, did they really?
Back. Yeah. It was pretty good. Learn about
interesting.
it. And then of course they get the earthquakes as well, which don't help them.
Yes, they do.
Anymore.
Knowing exactly.
Yeah.
And it's all sort of like built on weak clay foundations, so it's not good. Not particularly stable, that's for sure.
Yeah, definitely not ideal.
No. So, anywho, moving on with some basic information. So Mexico is a country, if you're not aware, in the southern portion of North America. So to its north, it's bordered by the United States, specifically the states of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. And obviously with those states, its history is deeply intertwined, as we'll come to later.
Yep.
And to its south and west by the Pacific Ocean, to the southeast by Belize, Guatemala, and the Caribbean Sea, and to its east by the Gulf of Mexico. Now, it's the 10th most populous country in the world and the 13th largest by area. And it also ranks 5th for natural biodiversity, which we always like to hear, and first in the Americas for UNESCO World Heritage Sites, many of which I'll obviously talk about throughout this episode.
That's unsurprising, isn't it? No.
Unsurprising indeed, yeah. And it also has one of the world's most diverse weather systems, as the Tropic of Cancer effectively divides the country into temperate and tropical zones. But obviously this makes it quite vulnerable to climate change as well, although it is actually a kind of leader among developing nations, which it still technically qualifies as on climate change policy, or has been since 2012 or so. So there we are. Now, moving on to some early history, and also I want to qualify some terms. So there's no consensus yet as to when humans first set foot in Mexico, but we do know that indigenous folk started to selectively breed maize there by about 8,000 BCE. There is also evidence for increased pottery working from about 2300 BCE and intensive corn farming from about 1800 BCE to 1500 BCE. But what we do know in a lot more detail is that from about the time of intensive farming in 1800 BCE, Mexico is home to many Mesoamerican civilizations, many of which have flourished for many, many centuries. So, before I discuss them, allow me to just clarify a couple of things to make things for a bit easier. So firstly, pre-Columbian Mesoamerica extends approximately from central Mexico through Belize, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and northern Costa Rica. So obviously my objective is to stick to Mexico as much as possible, but the story will occasionally slip into these other nations, as some of the most, say, spectacular Maya cities can be found in Belize and Guatemala. So there's a bit of that. Also, these civilizations were often coterminous with each other, at least at some point in time, so some skipping back and forth is kind of necessary. And it's also helpful to bear in mind the following framework for the pre-Columbian era, which I will try and stick to. So the first is the pre-classic period, which is between 1800 BC to 250 AD, the classic from 250 AD to 900 AD, and the post-classic period from 900 to 1521. Okay, so last thing I wanted to say is that there are lots of other civilizations and cities that I will not really talk about here, and there are just two in particular I wanted to highlight, and these are the Zapotecs and Mixtecs. And I thought I should take this opportunity just to apologize to them, particularly for the Zapotecs, because they had a really long run at the civilization game and established one of the great pre-Columbian cities in Monte Alban. So sorry to them for not giving them their due, but yeah. Moving on to the first major Mesoamerican civilization, who were the Olmecs. Now, they settled on the Gulf Coast near what is now Veracruz, and later established two major population centers. The first of these was San Lorenzo, which flourished from about 1200 to 900 BC until it was razed, possibly because of an uprising or environmental change. And the second was La Venta in Tabasco, which was itself abandoned, by around 400 BC. Now, this abandonment also marked the decline of Olmec power, and no one is quite sure what it was that precipitated this decline, but a combination of factors is likely. And this is kind of a running theme throughout the ancient civilizations. We don't really know often what happened to them or why it is that they declined.
Yeah,
anyway,
probably similar to the first instance, right?
You would think so. It's usually a combination of things anyway, isn't it?
Yeah.
Causality is never, that unidirectional, is it? Anyhow.
Well, yeah, I think as we've found out doing all of these episodes is usually, well, actually, like, it would be insane to think that one thing could actually tear apart an empire when you think about it.
Exactly. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So, regardless, their cultural influence was vast and spanned well beyond the areas they occupied. And indeed, they're generally regarded as the sort of progenitor civilization for others that would arise in the coming millennia. For example, they started a number of trends that many of us associate with Mesoamerican art, such as the giant head sculptures made from basalt, otherwise known as colossal heads. Some of these things could be absolutely ginormous, like 40 feet long or something like that. They also made mosaics, tiny jade figures, and of course earthen pyramids, the biggest of which can still be seen and visited in La Venta. So other innovations of theirs worth noting include a system of writing, which possibly makes them the first civilization in the Western Hemisphere to develop one, the concept of zero, the famous Mesoamerican bull game, which if any of our listeners have watched the film El Dorado, you will know vaguely what I'm referring to, although do bear in mind that film is not historically accurate in other respects, but that's okay.
Yep.
And finally, it's also speculated that the Olmecs were the first to use bloodletting during religious ceremonies and possibly sacrifices. For those who don't know, bloodletting was performed by piercing a soft body part, generally the tongue or indeed the penis, and scattering the blood or collecting it on a type of bark paper called amate, which would then be burned, and the rising smoke would essentially serve as an offering to the gods. Now, when it comes to sacrifices... We're going to
get an explicit logo on the Apple for that, I reckon.
Oh, come on, surely not.
Bit gruesome.
Well, a bit gruesome, but it's a sort of
mind you,
anthropological phenomenon, isn't it?
I have a sensitive disposition when it comes to things such as that. Go on then.
Yeah, I think most people of a male persuasion probably do when it involves that particular part of the body. Anyhow, now when it comes to sacrifices, the evidence is a bit scarcer. But, these are cultural idiosyncrasies that have their parallels in other Mesoamerican cultures in the region, such as the Maya, who we'll come on to shortly, which is one of the reasons that they are generally regarded a progenitor civilization and why that notion kind of makes sense. So by 600 BC, Olmec hegemony was already waning, but its eventual demise left a power vacuum in the Mexican Valley. So one prominent civilization to emerge from that vacuum was the Teotihuacan by around 300 BC. And by about 150 AD, they had established the first true metropolis of North America, which was given the same name, and this resided about 25 kilometers northeast of modern-day Mexico City. And at its zenith, the civilization is thought to have controlled a large portion of southern Mexico, and the city of Teotihuacan had as many as 125,000 inhabitants by 450 AD, which would have made it one of the biggest urban centers in the world at that time. Now, like the Olmecs, it's really big, huh? Like the Olmecs, the Teotihuacan were responsible for a number of artistic and architectural marvels, the most notable of which is probably the Avenue of the Dead, which I reckon we'll put a picture up on our Instagram account because it is a really awesome site. But perhaps their biggest legacy was political and economic. So, for example, although the Olmec civilization had a ruling class, these divisions were a lot more specific in Teotihuacan, and there were some sort of compounds found which show evidence for being segregated by class, of which high elites, middle elite, and labourers could be distinguished. Now, what is important to note here is that the spatial differentiation the elites enforced. So, archaeologists have found that the labouring classes were divided into farmers and skilled craftsmen, and the latter of which tended to be distributed in complex of apartments separated into specialised neighbourhoods, often physically buried from one another. So this seems to have helped stimulate internal competition and fuel productivity. However, thanks to its popularity as a place to work for the other Mesoamerican merchants, rising demand cannot always be met, and this would later come back to bite them on the bottom. So not dissimilarly to the Olmec, the reasons for Teotihuacan decline are uncertain, but archaeological evidence does suggest a combination of droughts occurring in the 6th century, which precipitated population decline, and then possible civil unrest in the 7th and 8th centuries as being responsible. So there we are. Now, on to the Maya. Now, Maya settlements began at least as early as 1800 BC, but it's between 250 and 900 AD that they truly thrived and arguably became the greatest of all pre-Columbian civilizations. So the Maya civilization was a bit more geographically centralized than other indigenous Mesoamerican groups, and at its height covered all of the Yucatan Peninsula and modern-day Guatemala, Belize, and parts of the Mexican states of Tabasco and Chiapas and the western part of Honduras and El Salvador, so pretty large. Nonetheless, it was politically disaggregated as it was composed of various city-states who were ruled by a king and who mediated the spiritual and physical realms. Now, this allowed a system of internal competition to develop and, correspondingly, distinct social cultures. These cities, which included Tikal, Copan and others, also established trading relations with the Teotihuacan and influenced the culture of the Aztecs later on too. Now, one thing that makes the Mayans particularly interesting is they were able to build a civilization largely in the rainforests of the Mexican and Central American lowlands. So generally, ancient civilizations flourished in drier climates where the centralized management of water resources through things like irrigation formed the basis of society.
Yeah.
So indeed, this is precisely the kind of structure that the Teotihuacan had followed. However, it seems that the lowlands were quite ecologically diverse, which enabled the cities to be surrounded by immense numbers of farms that sustain the needs of the cities. And like the Olmecs, the Mayas made significant strides in high culture. For instance, they were noted for their logosyllabic script, the most sophisticated and highly developed writing system in the pre-Columbian Americas. They also made advances in mathematics, astronomy, and left a vast architectural legacy, with the many pyramid temples and palaces adorned with sculptures and painted stucco reliefs. So being highly literate, they also recorded their history and ritual knowledge in what are now known as the Maya codices, of which only 3 uncontested examples remain after the rest were destroyed by the bleeding Spanish. Fortunately, we have been able to extract a lot of information from them, which is good. And a bit like the cases mentioned above, the demise of the classic Mayan period is a bit of a mystery, but it's likely that a combination of forces came into play, such as before, like environmental degradation, internecine warfare, and drought. So this led to many of the major cities in the south being abandoned and a large migration northward into the Yucatan area, where the Mayas continued to reside and flourish, albeit on a lesser scale than before, in fact well into the post-classic and indeed post-colonization periods. And I'll touch on that again momentarily. So, with the Teotihuacan and Mayan dominance beginning to wane, latitude for a new group to assert themselves and rise to prominence opened up. And the warlike Toltec, who had migrated from somewhere north of Teotihuacan, became the most successful of these cultural opportunists, and they established their imperial capital in the Central Valley of Mexico by the 10th century. Now, the rise of the Toltecs, who used their powerful armies to subjugate neighbouring societies, has been said by some scholars to have marked the beginning of militarism in Mesoamerican society. Of course, war had always occurred, but the Toltecs seemed to privilege their warrior class in a way that other civilizations at this point had not done, which is just one aspect of their culture that the Aztecs would later imbibe. So, the post-classic period began with the dominant Toltecs. However, over the next 300 years, internal conflict combined with an influx of new invaders would weaken the Toltec civilization until they were finally vanquished by the Chichimecha. I think that's about right. Who were...
Chichimecha,
that's better. Who were a collection of rugged tribes of undetermined origin, but probably somewhere along Mexico's northern frontier, as it always seems to be the northern frontier. So, the Toltec civilization effectively dissolved. However, the noble Toltec diaspora would continue to establish and preside over cities, and in fact, many of them were incorporated into the Aztec Empire, and others that would soon flourish.
Right.
So, now we move on to the Aztecs, who established an empire or paramountcy of the utmost grandeur, perhaps only comparable in the New World to the Incas of Peru, although some would also contest the Mayas too. So although the origin of the Aztecs is uncertain, remnant knowledge of their own tradition seems to suggest they were a hunter-gatherer tribe based in Altzan, a mystical place residing somewhere in the north of Mexico, once again. And coincidentally, this is where they get their name from, although they're often also referred to as the Mexica, which is where modern-day Mexicans get their name from too. So they decided to migrate southward sometime in the 12th century, for reasons that are not all that clear, but it does seem possible they were the last in the greater migration that took advantage of, or possibly even triggered, the Toltec decline. So their long pilgrimage, which consisted of trying to find somewhere to settle, was finally complete in 1325 AD, upon the banks of Lake Texcoco. It was here that the Mexica received a very particular but meaningful sign according to Aztec legend, which consisted of an eagle perched on a cactus patch devouring a snake. Thus they decided to build their capital on an artificial island and the surrounding swamplands, and this capital would come to be known as Tenochtitlan.
Nice. Nothing screams home quite like a big bird feasting on a snake, does it?
No, it doesn't.
Every time I see that, I'm always like, I wish I could build a house here.
Yeah, that was my first thought when I saw it. But hey, so each their own. And I'm glad you bring that up, because as a point of interest, the eagle and snake remains the national emblem of Mexico. So if you look at the Mexican flag, you'll see it slap bang in the middle, and now you know what that means.
Lovely bit of vexology there.
Indeed, right? So by this point, various other city-states had been established in the central Mexican basin. So the Mexica started off by acquiring allies and tributaries through employment as mercenaries. So as fierce warriors, they quickly gained momentum and formed a triple alliance in 1428 with the Texcocans and the Tacubans to defeat the most powerful rivals in the region, the Tapanec. And the alliance would also conquer smaller civilizations to the east and west, though this entente would not last for long in this form. So in 1440, Moctezuma I took power, and he would later be remembered as the father of the Aztec Empire. It was through his skill as a commander and warrior that by the 16th century, the Aztecs, either through conquest or commerce, had come to rule over some 500 small states known as calpuli, all of which had its own governing council, school, army, temple, and land, but paid tribute to the supreme leader.
Right, so, like, because I know there's, like, a revisionist kind of way that people sometimes say, well, it wasn't really an empire, was it? Like, because they didn't exercise the type of power that an empire would over its vast territories.
This is largely true. I think, many historians and anthropologists tend to call it a paramountcy. It's the word they prefer, which basically says that they are the supreme power over a sort of collection of states or smaller states. But they don't exercise the kind of rule by decree or arbitrary power that perhaps an emperor would have done, like the Holy Roman Emperor, for instance.
Right.
You know. So that
I've never heard that word before, and I really like it.
Yeah, I do. I like it. I think it actually suits what it's trying to describe quite well. So at its height, the Aztec Empire ruled over some 5 to 6 million people, including their 2 former allies who had now been incorporated into this system. And of course, the Aztecs are famous for lots of things, but perhaps most notably is their extraordinary religious ceremonies that feature dances, processions, and often sacrifices. Now, it's the latter of these things I wanted to discuss, and I've kind of been wanting to discuss all the way through this part of the discussion. So, as you all know, listeners, one of the things we try and do at the National Histories podcast is resist any temptation to Eurocentrism or Western bias. So, in that vein, I thought it worth pointing out that the Aztecs were not as bloodthirsty as often made out. So, depending on where you look, some have suggested that thousands upon thousands of people were ritually killed every month during the Aztec hegemony, but this is simply not the case. So, the Aztecs did indeed practice sacrifice to appease the sun god. However, this would only be as many as a few dozen on a bad month, as it were. It's also necessary to point out that the sacrifices were typically prisoners of war, and actually the best of the prisoners, which presumably served some kind of political purpose too, since this would inhibit the possibility of an uprising, plus the weaker ones would be put to work. And they're not exactly like alone, are they? No, and I think there's sort of emerging evidence now for ritual sacrifice in lots of other civilizations or ancient civilizations all over the world. So I think it's one of those interesting things that like they have become uniquely remembered for it. And don't get me wrong, they did practice it, and as I'm going to sort of touch on in a second, it's probably the Toltec who are remembered or should be remembered more for it because they actually practice it more frequently than the Aztecs did. But it was often like a scare tactic and political device. And if you were to trade with the Aztecs or if you were to submit to them voluntarily, they wouldn't just randomly sacrifice you. It was kind of more of a militaristic thing. So I think it's important to point out, because if you talk to most people who don't have much of a knowledge of the Aztecs, that's the first thing they kind of think of. And I think there's a bit of an irony here when you think like, you know, we were still planting heads on spikes outside the Tower of London around this time, and in fact until much later. So, you know, it's like, is it really that much better? Not really. It just didn't have as much religious significance. I don't know if that's a fair parallel, but I think it is. But I did want to say here too that if you are interested in Aztec and sort of pre-Columbian revisionism, then I would highly suggest you check out Dan Snow's History Hit podcast with Camilla Townsend, who's written a new book about it, and she talks about this kind of stuff in more detail.
Dan Snow.
Good old Dan Snow. It's a great source. Anyway, despite near constant fighting with recalcitrant neighbours, the Aztecs were sitting pretty well into the 16th century until an unexpected turn of events would swiftly bring their demise.
Bloody Europeans.
Yes. So, Francisco Hernández de Córdoba was the first European to visit Mexican territory on purpose and arrived in the Yucatan region from Cuba with 3 ships and about 100 men. Now, I say on purpose because 2 men had been dragged up on the coast after a shipwreck in 1511, one of which would become an important interpreter to the man who oversaw the conquering of the Aztec Empire / paramountcy. I'll come back to him soon. Okay. Anyways, Córdoba was sponsored by the Spanish governor in Cuba called Diego Velázquez, who wanted to find a new route to Asia and had heard whispers of the riches of the Central and North American interior. And no, this is not the same Diego Velázquez as the painter of Las Meninas and other such masterpieces, and I know you were thinking that, Lucas.
Yes,
Anyway.
of course. I know art.
Of course. Anyway, the Spaniards were met with some hostility, and after half of his men were murdered, he swiftly returned to Cuba to tell the governor of their troubles. Frustrated by the natives' totally unwarranted lack of hospitality, Velázquez decided to send a much larger force back to Mexico under the command of the most Machiavellian of conquistadors, the infamous Hernán Cortés.
Of course.
So, come February 1519, and Cortés had set sail from Cuba with a sizable fleet of 11 ships containing more than 450 soldiers, lots of supplies, and some horses to boot. So obviously the Spanish were much better prepared this time, and shortly after arriving in Yucatan, they quickly took control of Tabasco. It was in Tabasco that the Spaniards began learning about the great Aztec civilization, which was ruled at that time by Moctezuma II. Cortés then decided to flout the authority of Velázquez by founding the city of Veracruz on the Gulf of Mexico directly east of the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. And it should be said that their relationship was already pretty sour. But if you are interested in learning more about that, I'll let you do it, but it's too complicated to tell here.
Yeah, cool. All right.
So come late 1519, and Cortés began his famous march into the Mexican interior, with an entourage of some 500, including a few native slaves who had been captured after a scrap with some Maya people. Now, one of these slaves was originally the slave and concubine of one of Cortés' captains, but when her linguistic gift came to the fore, she began serving Cortés more directly as a translator and advisor in exchange for some more liberty, in air quotes, such were the apparent words of Cortés himself. Now, this lady is known as La Malinche, or yes, indeed, right. So this lady is now known as La Malinche, or Marina, and her place in Mexican history is rather contentious. So following the word Malinche, she has often been viewed as the embodiment of treachery, whereas more recent feminist revisionism has argued that she made the best out of a bad lot. Make of that what you will. That all said, she also became Cortés' mistress, and would later give birth to his son Martin, who is widely regarded as the first mestizo, meaning people of both native Mexican and Spanish origin. So between La Malinche and another interpreter called Jerónimo de Aguilar, who, if you remember, was one of our shipwrecked pair from earlier, Cortés was able to negotiate the needed alliance to pave the way for the Spanish conquest, which was also helped by the hostility to the Aztecs felt by other indigenous groups, most prominently the Tlaxcala, who were longtime rivals of the Aztecs. So when Cortés arrived in the figurative gates of Tenochtitlan with his 6,000 strong entourage made up of Spaniards but mostly indigenous groups allied to him, they were welcomed as honoured guests by Moctezuma and his people. Now, many sources will tell you that this is because Cortés resembled the serpent god Quetzalcoatl, whom almost all Mesoamerican people were thought to be descended from, and who was prophesied to return in Aztec legend in around the same year of the arrival of Cortés. However, many scholars have since argued that this is a bit of a misnomer, as this claim is only found in Spanish texts and written some 50 years later. So their suspicion, which is one I partially share, is that this was propagated by Cortés himself as a way of exaggerating the Aztecs' primitivism and gullibility. And, you know, I think we've come across other instances of this, haven't we, in other episodes, where things have just been exaggerated by conquerors to demonstrate either the immorality or primitivism of a people, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So, quite a common trope, really. Nevertheless, it does seem quite fitting that Cortés became associated with a serpentine figure, as he would quickly prove to be a slippery and slithery boy indeed.
Slithery, nice.
I was hoping you were going to say that.
Yeah, I know you were.
If any listener doesn't get that reference, then you should check out the meme on YouTube because it's hilarious. Anyway,
or you shouldn't if you don't want it in your head forever, and then you'll be forced to do that whenever anyone mentions.
That's also true, and also perhaps if you don't have as puerile a sense of humour as we do, then you might not find it so entertaining. So for several months things ticked over, but tensions slowly grew as the Tenochtitlan elite became suspicious of Cortés' intentions. And, these suspicions were validated when Cortés and his men took Moctezuma hostage amidst some hostility directed towards the Spaniards and their allies. It should also be said that the locals' frustration was partly directed against Moctezuma, who some thought to be weak and too acquiescent to Cortés. Thus, there is also some debate as to whether it was the Spaniards or the Mexica themselves who executed him shortly after his imprisonment in his own palace. Anyway, cutting an intricate story short, by 1521 Tenochtitlan had been conquered despite some valiant resistance led by the emperor's nephew Cuauhtemoc, and Cortés proceeded to raise the brilliant city of Tenochtitlan and began building New Mexico on its ruins, which would quickly become the preeminent European centre of the New World. Now, while it took the Spaniards many more years to conquer all of central and southern Mexico, and even longer to take the north, we can say that with the destruction of Tenochtitlan, this effectively marked the colonial period.
Yeah.
So, as we've touched on in
I just
other
feel that's
episodes,
so, like, it's just such a sad story, you know, like, in some ways, the Mexica,
Mexica.
yeah, they were just getting underway, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I didn't realise the Aztecs were actually as short-lived as they were.
They were just getting started. They could, the paramountcy could have soon become empire.
Yeah, well, indeed. I mean, it's one of those.
Happened.
Yeah, I mean, who only knows? I'm sure there are some books sort of written in that thought experimenty kind of way. You know, what would have happened had there never been, or had the colonization never taken place.
I guess.
I mean, we can only imagine what
Alex,
what would have become.
We're not the national alternative histories.
No, indeed,
the national histories.
We are the national histories. So yeah, not worth pondering here, but at the same time, still interesting.
Though.
Yeah. Anywho, as we have touched on in other episodes in this podcast, and will no doubt do so again, the indigenous population declined substantially in the immediate years after Spanish colonization, with the invaders bringing with them all sorts of new diseases. In fact, it's estimated that about 24 million people perished between 1521 and 1605, which is pretty astonishing. Although, you know, I should add that not all of these deaths were down to disease alone, but a very high proportion is likely. So, there we are. The Spaniards also brought a new religion to Mexico too, as the first Catholic missionaries were turning up by 1523, presumably offering the locals some grand justification for their bringing fresh bouts of disease with them. But whatever they were saying, they were rather successful, and so successful in fact that by 1560, some 100 monasteries had been built and millions of people had converted, thus signalling the rise of an important player in Mexican politics from here on in. It should also be said that many of the missionaries were good people who protected the indigenous folk from the worst excesses of the more brutal colonists. Indeed, they were also an important force in getting the enslavement of indigenous people abolished in the 1550s, though this was largely replaced with black slavery, which many of them actively defended.
Right, so wait, that's quite interesting though, I didn't know that. But then, what am I trying to say here? Like, I know that wasn't the case in, like, Costa Rica and other places. So was it just in that bit?
I think so. I mean, not to say that, you know, their position in the social hierarchy was particularly good. It was an effective form of rubbish,
you know.
Yeah, it was almost an effective form of enslavement, obviously with the encomiendas and whatnot. Yeah, essentially. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I suppose perhaps because there was still, I mean, at this point there was still like indigenous holdings in the south and the north that hadn't been conquered. So I'm not sure perhaps of whether it had been if it was so easy necessarily to practice slavery. But yeah, the missionaries did play quite an important role in reversing that, and also an important role in getting the indigenous people recognised as human beings, which came in 1527, I believe, because for a number of years they weren't sure whether they were or not. You know, that kind of thing. Yeah. That was effectively declared by the king, I believe. Anyway, so Spain established firm control over the Mexican Valley area by the late 1500s, as well as most of the Maya regions in the south, which had successfully resisted the colonization process at first. Though even then, some pockets of the Maya would hold out until 1671, which goes to show how spirited and tough they really were. Now, the Spaniards would eventually incorporate most of northern Mexico too by the 19th century, such that 19th century New Spain included the US states of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, Utah, and Colorado. Although it should be said that Spanish rule over these territories was always transient and loose. So, through the course of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, a system of exploitation and domination was cultivated and administered by the Viceroyalty of New Spain. Now, this typically revolved around exploiting the mineral wealth found in the northern provinces such as the Zacatecas and Guanajuato regions and subjecting the pool of indigenous folk to forced labour on haciendas. So, within this system, distinct classes arose, those being the Peninsulares, who were the Spanish-born colonists. Now, they occupied the most important government posts and dominated commercial enterprises and became very wealthy. Next in the social hierarchy came the Criollos, who we've come across before, who were the Spaniards born in Mexico. They also tended to be wealthy, but occupied minor positions within government. Next were the mestizos, who, if you remember, had both Spanish and Mexican heritage. Now, they would often serve as soldiers, priests, or supervise shops and so forth. And at the bottom were the native populations who laboured in the mines and lived in virtual slavery. And then, of course, there was the slave population. Now, over time, tensions between the peninsulares and criollos intensified as the latter wanted more political power. Likewise, the mestizos and natives were frustrated at their comparative lack of opportunity and disenfranchisement. And then, with the Spanish crown growing concerned about the Catholic Church's increasing power, Charles III decided to expel the Jesuits from New Spain in 1767 and confiscate lots of church property. Now, this hit the criollos and mestizos hard, and together with Spanish decline and the proliferation of liberal ideas in the region, thanks in large part to the revolution that had taken place to its north and back across the Atlantic in France, the seeds for casting off the colonial yoke were well and truly laid. Okay. So, come 1808, and a pesky little Corsican man decided to occupy Spain as part of his quest for European domination and prop up his brother as its new king.
Oh, of course. Here we go.
Here we come.
Like many a Latin American nation.
Indeed.
American nation. He's got to be talked about, hasn't he?
Of course. Always sneaks his way in there. And as you might imagine, this compromised Spain's ability to control its overseas territories. So with its grip on New Spain loosening, an unassuming parish priest by the name of Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla, from the town of Dolores, issued a call to rebellion. And when I say call to rebellion, I am being literal, because on the morning of September 16th, 1810, he rang his church bells and gave a speech known as the Cry of Dolores, which fired up the locals and officially began the Criollo-led rebellion. So Mexicans today still celebrate September 16th as a national holiday, and Hidalgo himself is referred to as the father of the nation.
Oh,
Good for him. Now, the rebellion was long and drawn out and involved the death of Hidalgo himself and several other rebel leaders. So the rebellion was finally victorious in 1821 when its leader Vicente Guerrero and the defeated royalist leader Agustin de Iturbide drew up a constitution together, which would forever ensure that no one would ever declare themselves emperor again or have such de facto executive powers.
No, I know you're lying there.
You do, and you're right. So just kidding. So Iturbide had a change of heart and decided to declare himself emperor of Mexico instead. So, you know.
With the name Augustine,
I
mean, his parents definitely wanted him to be emperor, didn't they?
That's a good point. I didn't think of that until you just raised it. Very true. Yeah. They should have seen that coming. Guerrero should never, ever got in bed with him.
No, everyone should have just gone, well, obviously we're not giving you any kind of power because you will try and become the emperor.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, if only they thought about it in the terms that you just have. Perhaps they could have avoided it.
Never mind. First name prejudices. Real thing.
Yeah.
No. Yeah. Don't do that, everyone.
So this empire also included the southern parts of what was formerly New Spain, such as Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and parts of Chiapas. However, if you've listened to our Costa Rica episode, then you will know that this was not really an empire at all, since a lot of the people it was supposedly ruling over didn't even know it existed before it finished. So,
yes, yeah, indeed.
Strange set of circumstances. Now, the rebel elite were not best pleased with this, so Guerrero, in collaboration with an officer named Antonio López de Santa Anna, decided to overthrow Iturbide. They then drafted a new constitution, which established the Mexican Republic, modelled to some extent on the American Constitution. And between 1823 to 54, Antonio López would serve as president on 11 occasions, which gives you some insight into how tumultuous politics was at the time. In fact, I think between 1820 to 1860, they had 50 different presidents, which is mental. Wow. Anyhow, the major pull and tug was between liberals and conservatives. There were lots of rebellions and disputes with foreign powers, such as the French, who actually briefly invaded in 1938, though they were quickly repulsed, and then the United States, to whom Mexico would cede much of its northern territories to after the War of 1846 to 1848. Now, with Mexico reeling from its internal strife and the humiliation of losing much of its territory to the US, Santa Anna decided to sell even more to the Americans under the pretext that the money was needed to rebuild the army. However, he decided to pocket most of it, and so, take a guess.
He was overthrown, I'm sure.
He was overthrown, of course.
Yeah.
So this time by the Liberals, who by this point had coalesced into an actual political unit, although the radical and moderate factions were still there. And in 1857 they created a new constitution, which limited the power of the executive, the Catholic Church and the army, and empowered disenfranchised peasants, called for freedom of religion and the press, and civil marriages. So, nice and progressive. And who do you think this displeased?
The elites and the conservatives.
Precise. So they effectively created a parallel assembly in Mexico City, which kicked off the War of Reform. Now, this war was won by the Liberals in 1861 under the leadership of the first Zapotec Indian to be elected president of the Republic, a man named Benito Juarez. Now, Juarez played a significant role in the 1857 Constitution and is probably the only politician from that era that practically all Mexicans today hold in high regard. So, big thumbs up for Juarez. However, he did default on some debts to the French, Spanish and Brits, as the War of Reform had bankrupted the country, which none of the aforementioned parties liked, so they all decided to send troops to Veracruz. Now, the Spanish and British didn't hang around all that long, but the French had a more grandiose idea in mind. Namely, they wanted to overthrow the Republic and install a monarchy in its place, which of course was supported by the Conservatives, Catholic Church, and even some indigenous groups too. So they managed this in 1862 after defeating the Mexican army, and then decided on a Habsburg Archduke, Ferdinand Maximilian of Austria, who became Emperor Maximilian I of Mexico in 1862.
He was, there's a good biographics video on that guy's life.
Yeah.
Just if anyone wants to watch it, because he had quite an interesting life himself. So. Aside from becoming Emperor of Mexico.
Yeah. I don't know anything about him before that point. But yeah, okay, interesting. So he and his wife, Empress Carlota, noticed quite quickly how unequal Mexican society was, and so they decided the only logical course of action was to return to favouring the upper-class white Mexicans over the mestizos and indigenous population, because, makes sense, of course. Now, Maximilian was, however, liberal in other respects, and decided he would share power with the democratically elected Congress. Now, the Conservatives didn't like this, and the Republicans wouldn't accept the idea of a monarchy at all, and the peasantry didn't like the fact that once again they were being sidelined by those in power just after the first real period of progress. So suffice it to say that the Emperor and the Empress did not have many allies, and after the United States had finished having its war with itself, it then demanded that the French bugger off, which Napoleon III quite willfully did, considering that Mexico had made basically no money for the French as they had hoped. However, Maximilian stayed behind to use his diminishing imperial forces to fight the Republicans, who were victorious come 1867, and in 68, Maximilian and two native allies of his were captured and executed, which has since been immortalised in the painting by Edouard Manet. It's actually one of my personal favourites, funny enough. So, the Republic was back.
What, one of your personal favourites is a painting of someone being captured and executed?
Oh, yeah.
Peculiar taste, morbid taste.
Yeah, I mean, I like it. I look Edouard Manet quite a lot, but yeah, it's a good painting.
Okay, fair enough.
So the Republic was back, and Benito Juarez once again took the helm until his death in 1872, during which time he continued his reforms of ensuring that the Catholic Church could only own houses of worship and monasteries and other such things as that.
Okay.
To come 1876, and a general by the name of Porfirio Diaz, who had fought valiantly for the Republicans in the War of Reform and against the French, came to power. Now, he rebelled against President Lerdo, who had been re-elected for his second term, which ran counter to the no re-election rule. Right, now, Juarez himself had done this, but everybody liked him, and nobody wanted to pop him off, so it was okay. Anyway.
Kind of set the precedent for it, though.
Yeah, Anyway, Diaz swiftly did away with the very no re-election rule he had used as his pretext to overthrow Lerdo, and would effectively rule until 1910. So a bit of irony there. So giving him his due, he did bring Mexico into the industrial age, building telephone and railway lines and investing heavily in other public works projects. Indeed, the Mexican economy grew pretty much throughout the entirety of his reign, and he also managed to keep Mexico free from civil wars, which was pretty welcome, considering how messy things have been since independence. However, this did come at the expense of free elections, a free press, and united political opposition, all of which were banned. And peasants were also cheated out of their land and forced to work in dire conditions, devoid of any means by which they might have expressed their discontent. Indeed, during this period, Mexico's already gratuitous inequalities got worse, as Diaz did the things that dictators do, such as favouring his allies, gifting them handsome contracts, and so on. So, come 1910, and Diaz had upset a lot of people. Plus, he wasn't really doing it for anyone anymore, even his allies. So, conscious of this, he said in an interview that he would not stand for re-election. But he did so anyway, and likely rigged the outcome since the very popular Francisco Madero received only a few hundred votes. So, There we are. Rather typical.
Yeah, what is it just with these... I mean, I say this all the time.
I know.
But just these dictators and just glaring lack of subtlety when it comes to
Yes.
rigging elections.
I know. I don't get it. I don't get it.
It's a certain personality type, I swear. There's just a certain type of person that just can't accept they're not loved by everyone. And
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean,
Yeah.
I guess the word for it is hubris, isn't it? Because you have to be supremely arrogant to think that you can kind of get away with that kind of thing, and there not be repercussions. But obviously, in this instance, there were repercussions, and Diaz probably knew that in advance. But anyway, Madero and other revolutionary leaders predictably had themselves an uprising, which led to the defeat of the army and the resignation of Diaz in 1911. However, the fight was not over, and over the next 9 years or so, more rebellions and counter-revolutions would break out. Now, this period was remarkably confusing, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but suffice it to say that the intermittent fighting that took place was catastrophically bloody, with at least 2 million casualties in total. And many historians mark 1917 as the end of the revolution, since this is when the current constitution was promulgated, although there have been lots of amendments to it since. In large part, though, this constitution was progressive in orientation and sought to re-establish a Juarez ideal of free public education and government control of church property and wealth, though this would cause problems further on down the line too. It also assumed the government's ability to reclaim land and the resources that resided below it, and allowed the peasantry to unionize and regulate their working hours and conditions. So, the 20s were dominated by 3 Sonoran generals of the Constitutionalist Army who had been victorious in the end. Now, this period saw some of the reforms proposed by the Constitution take place, albeit quite slowly and pragmatically, under the first leadership of General Obregón. However, in 1924, Plutarco Elias Calles assumed the presidency and tried to live up to his election rhetoric of cracking down on Catholic power, which resulted in the Cristero War. Now, although the Catholic militants effectively lost, the anti-clerical provisions in the constitution were not really implemented nationwide, so tempers were somewhat appeased for the time being. And in 1928...
Do you know why the Catholics were so Catholic power was so disliked?
I think because Catholic power was very much intertwined with the sort of whole class structure.
Oh, okay. Right, yeah.
And through a lot of the colonial period, they've been buying up a lot of property that wasn't clerical property. And as a consequence, they just have far too much political sway.
Right.
So yeah,
okay, yeah.
that's kind of one of the central tensions, I guess, at the heart of Mexican politics throughout this entire period.
Okay, cool.
So wanting to avoid... Oh no, wrong part. So in 1928, the presidential term of Calles ended, and he was succeeded by former president Obregón. However, Obregón was swiftly assassinated by the Catholics, as he was an ally of Calles, which... I think seems a bit unfair, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
Considering it was Calles who carried out the suppression.
Yeah. It's harsh. But...
Yeah. And Obregón was the one who was...
just bad anyway. I've never...
Well, yeah, of course. But he was the one who at first was a bit more pragmatic and didn't really pursue those policies. So it seems unfair that he was the one who was then targeted. Anyhow.
Yeah, definitely.
So wanting to avoid more war and a return to the bloody 1910s, the revolutionary generals and other elites agreed that an interim president should be elected, during which time a new party would be established, which would effectively bring an end to strongman rule. Now, founded in 1929, this party was called the National Revolutionary Party, or NRP. And after his election in 1934, Lázaro Cárdenas reformed the party into the Mexican Revolutionary Party, or PRM, and revitalized earlier revolutionary reforms and set out on a course of radical nationalism. For example, in the 1920s through to the 60s, more than 400,000 square kilometres of land was redistributed from large estates to peasants and small farmers. So nearly half of the population received land, mainly in the form of ejidos or communal landholdings. And this essentially involved establishing communally shared tracts of farmland, which benefited the Mexican citizens and the economy alike.
Right.
However, these genuinely radical social policies were not to last, as the party, which was reformed again into the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or PRI, in the 40s, became more conservative, more corrupt, more centralised, and downright brutish as the years wore on. So during this time, Mexico also discovered its large oil reserves sequestered in the Gulf of Mexico, which Cárdenas had nationalised. So this had the effect of skewing economic development towards dependency on oil. Now this had led to a boom up until the 70s, but that was suddenly brought to a halt with the oil crisis and oil's fluctuating price in the 80s, which left the Mexican economy in a constant state of flux.
Yeah, I feel like the oil crisis in particular is something that we mention again and again and again. Like, just like the left-handed Corsican man. With
Yeah.
problem about being seen with his height.
Yeah. And probably the two world wars. So turning back to the PRI, it's fair to say that it was well and truly dishonored in the minds of many Mexicans after the Tlatelolco, I think that's about right, massacre of 1968, in which some 400 civil liberties protesters were shot dead. So this highlighted just how much the PRI was relying on strongman tactics, suppression and fraud to sustain its power. Now, this emergent cynicism reached fever pitch with the presidency of Carlos Salinas de Gortari, who assumed office in 1988 after a mysterious computer failure had halted vote tallying at a crucial point.
Right.
His opponent didn't contest it, though, stating that he wanted to save Mexico from civil war, despite the fact it was very obviously fraud. But good for him for putting his country first.
I guess that's all right.
So Salinas served his term, during which time drug trafficking through Mexico grew into a huge business and the number of high-profile murders proliferated. So on this front, Salinas was seemingly slow to react to the emergent threats this posed. He did, however, take steps to liberalise the state behemoth, and this was exemplified by the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, which boosted exports and industry, though this also provoked the ire of some smallholders and small business owners who were concerned about US import competition. Right. Now, in the last year of his presidency, the left-wing Zapatista uprising, as you mentioned earlier, in Mexico's southernmost state, Chiapas, occurred. Now, while the uprising was quickly quashed, the Zapatista remain an important voice for indigenous rights in Mexico today, and relations between them and the Mexican government are a bit more salubrious, although occasionally fractious. But yeah, they are an important political voice today. And in fact, I think it was 2018 that they had their first governor elected to the Senate. I think. I might be wrong on that, but I think. So Salinas' successor, Ernesto Zedillo, responded to the demands for democratic reforms by establishing a new, independently supervised electoral system, which effectively paved the way for his own party to finally be ousted in 2000 to Vicente Fox and his Partido Acción Nacional party, or PAN. So although Fox's presidency was historic for the fact it was the first time a non-PRI president had been elected in 70 years, his reign is remembered with disappointment as he failed to push forward with reforms, thanks in part to the fact that he did not have the majority he needed in Congress.
That's always going to be a problem, isn't it?
Indeed it is. But at least it kind of showed that the democratic process was, working a bit more effectively now. So in 2006, Fox was succeeded by Felipe Calderón, making him the second PAN president. And to the surprise of some, Mexico managed to spring back quite well from the 2008 crisis. And in 2012, he was lauded for enshrining some ambitious carbon emissions targets into law, which made Mexico something of a global sustainability champion. However, that's about as far as one can go with the positives of his presidency, as it's more or mostly remembered for its war on drugs, which had catastrophic effects for Mexican civil society.
Yeah, indeed.
So as I said, since the 70s, drug trafficking through Mexico from Colombia had been rising sharply as they wanted to avoid using the Caribbean Sea. And while Presidents Zedillo and Fox had already deployed the armed forces against the violent mobs running the multi-billion trade, they had largely failed to reduce violence or mitigate their ability to corrupt anything they basically wished to. So by the time of Calderón's election, some 2,000 people had already been killed, chiefly as a consequence of brutal turf wars between rival mobs. And then Calderón decided to mobilize 50,000 troops, primarily along the US border. And while some top gang leaders were captured and huge sums of drugs seized, extrajudicial killings also rose dramatically, with some 60,000 deaths during the 6 years of his presidency, which is an astonishingly high number.
That's more than pretty much, like, with the exception of maybe Syria. That's more than more than most contemporary wars.
It's for sure. So I mean, it is unfortunately the thing that characterizes the last 20 years of Mexican politics, really more than anything else. So when the number of killings finally started to fall at the end of Calderón's presidency, many people believe this was simply because the two strongest mobs, the Sinaloa cartel in the northwest of Mexico and Los Zetas in the northeast, had effectively wiped out their weaker rivals. And more recently, President Obrador pursued a different kind of policy to combat this problem under the slogan "Hugs, not gunshots," which, despite the nice undertones of that phrase, has not had the desired effect. And in fact, in 2018, there was a sort of another spate of violence, which has continued to now. Shame. Yes.
But it kind of reminds me of the, what do we call it? The Cameron's early 2010s motto of like hug a hoodie.
Yeah.
Do you remember that? Do you remember when politics was about hugging hoodies? And then from 2016, it's just gone down the toilet, hasn't it? Before, the biggest concern was about hoodies walking around and maybe doing a bit of vandalism.
Yeah, it's it's kind of every 50-year-old suburban person's worry, isn't it? The hoodie on the streets.
Well, it's much better than worrying about gunshots and extrajudicial killings.
I guess so. So I guess I've left it on a bit of a somber note there. But like I say, it is still kind of an issue that captures the public imagination, and not just the public imagination, but affects the public in lots of ways. Mexico remains also an extremely unequal society. Some attempts to address that have been made, but still really far away off from where it probably should be. But
it just had a hugely tumultuous sort of like start to the 20th century, didn't it? And I mean, that's always going to destroy your country's ability for years and years and years, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, the thing is, it hasn't had a functioning democracy for longer than 20 years.
Yeah.
And obviously corruption is still rife. So it's, I mean, as to where it would rank on one of those democracy indices, I wouldn't imagine it's particularly high. But it was a one-party democracy for more or less 80 years. And they dominated pretty much. I mean, I think they only lost a seat in the Senate in like the 80s. So I mean, like, they really did have everything under their thumb.
When you get like that kind of situation, I mean, just corruption just inevitably becomes.
It's inevitable byproduct of it. And then obviously when you factor in the rise of the drug gangs, etc., it just makes it 10 times worse. I mean, difficult place to lots of things to correct. As to how one does them, I don't know. But yeah, so a long, extremely interesting, often tumultuous history, that's for sure. But yeah, I hope you found it interesting, mate, and I hope you have listeners.
Yeah, I definitely did. I think, it's another one of those countries that, like, because of the resources and population that it has, it should be doing better than it is, I always think. Like, on paper, with basic statistics, you'd look at that and go, yeah, it's probably rich. And then you see these recurring problems in the society. I think it's quite sad, really, just learning about that.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I also think Mexico is quite a good case study for how long-term the effect of colonialism can be. I mean, it's not to say that that society wasn't socially stratified before the arrival of the Spaniards, because obviously it really was, and doing that thought experiment again, had the Spaniards never arrived, it probably would have remained so, as societies would have developed. But a lot of this stuff, when you look at it, it has its roots very much in the
strict class
fabric that was created. Very much so. And the distribution of property and so on. I mean, it's fair to say that
you do that for like over 300 years or whatever.
I always like to remind people of this sometimes, because you do hear it, don't you? People will sort of say, oh, well, I mean, in Mexico's case, they've been independent for 199 going on 200 years. So surely by now they should have divested themselves of all of that stuff. And it's like, well, it's not that simple, is it? If you leave the state architecture in place,
changing it,
if you leave state architecture in place that is skewed towards a particular minority group, that minority group aren't going to give it up, are they? So I mean, hey, it's complicated stuff, but there we are. That's the history of Mexico. I hope you've enjoyed it. And gracias to you, sir, for listening. So as usual, listeners, do check us out on our social media accounts, Twitter, Facebook and Instagram, and also be on the lookout for our YouTube channel, which we will be creating quite soon. It's quite possible, in fact, that by the time this goes out, we might have made it and have something on there, but we will see. So once again, thank you very much for listening, and we hope to have you back for our next episode. But in the meantime, adios.